Ladies and gentlemen, version 2.1 is just a couple of hours away. And one thing very new that's going to be coming with every single patch is, of course, the character banner. And so when it comes to version 2.1, there's not going to be the typical rerun cycle that we saw back in 2.0. We're only going to be seeing one character on banner for the first half, and then we're going to be seeing two characters, Brant and Changli, on the second half. And so with that, I wanted to take a look at the overall value of the different banners that we're going to be seeing, including the weapon and, of course, the character, and give you all a little bit of a perspective, right? Especially if you're somebody who maybe likes to build pity, if you're somebody who sometimes just likes pulling, even though you're not necessarily saving up for a character, to give you advice on whether or not any of these banners in particular are worth it, depending on the state of your account, how you want to vertically or horizontally invest, and the value of some of the later sequence nodes. Because when it comes to 4-star characters, and let me just be entirely honest here, some 4-star characters have very good sequence nodes. For example, we do have Sanhua with her S6 over here, and this S6, a 20% attack buff to the entire team once she goes through her rotation. This is one of the strongest buffs you can have for any basic attack focused character, right? Think your Encores or your Camellias. And getting something like this on your account can be the difference between you clearing something in the tower and missing it by a couple of seconds. And it's a great way to progress the strength of your roster, both vertically and horizontally, right? You vertically invest in the character, but you horizontally enable more teams. And so, or some of these later sequence nodes, especially for the 4-star characters, are very helpful. And of course, when it comes to the weapons, sometimes having high refinements for weapons is very useful too. And so with that, what we're going to be doing today is going over all of the different banners that are going to be in version 2.1 and advise a little bit on how strong each of these options are as they progress more and more. So with that, we're just going to start off with Phoebe. Phoebe is going to be that very first banner. And alongside her, for the 4 stars, you're going to have Lumi, Shisha, and Alto. And so we're going to start off by taking a look at Lumi, taking a bit of an examination of her dupes and how she can change the game for your account as you get more copies of her. Unfortunately, there's an elephant in the room when it comes to this character. She's only been on one banner so far. Her first run, the first time she was on banner, was when we had the whole Zhongli and Yinlin banner at the latter end of version 1.4. And chances are, if you had pulled Lumi back, then you only got one copy of her, because chances were you probably already had Yinlin and you had the free copy of Zhongli. So there was very little reason, if at all, to pull on that banner and actually get dupes of this character. And so with that, as you kind of go through her first sequence node is kind of useless. You gain some additional stamina, but in most situations, this is really an overworld only sequence node. It's not something you're going to get a huge amount of value from in the tower because you're doing much faster rotations with her. Her second one does improve her personal damage a good amount, but nothing too crazy to write home about because it only works on 2 of her abilities, her resonance skill. Her third one is just a straight damage boost to her liberation, so nothing too crazy here, but overall not bad. And her fourth is just a straight up stat boost. And so what you're seeing is that this character really focuses on that personal damage growth as she gets more and more copies of her, and less on the supporting side. The unfortunate part about that, though, is you likely already have a broad blade character that's going to be dealing a lot of damage on your teams. Or you likely already have an electro character that's dealing damage on your teams. And the unfortunate part is that, well, she kind of needs a lot of copies to feel good to use and to feel strong, but getting her copies was extremely difficult. And you can see over here, it's just straight multiplier increases to her kit or personal stamina recovery. However, when she does get to S6, this is where she gets a lot more interesting. She gains that same attack buff to the entire team that we're seeing for a lot of other 4 stars in the category, right? People like Mortifi, like Sanhua, characters like that who are very high value, and Lumi is in the same exact boat. She becomes a much more viable dual DPS partner, especially in combination with her outro skill buff, which just straight up buffs resonance skill damage by 38%, unfortunately for a shorter duration of 10 seconds. She becomes a much better team supporter when she is at S6. But let's be honest here, ladies and gentlemen. What are your chances of getting her S6 on Phoebe's banner unless you're willing to pull a shit ton of copies of Phoebe? there's almost no chance that you're going to be getting her S6 unless you're going for like Phoebe's S1 or her S2. So hopefully, potentially, right, you'll be able to get it if this is something you really want, but it's a bit risky. It's a bit risky to go for it. If you already have a bunch of copies from pulling on Yinlin and Zhang, maybe you'll be able to finish it off, but do realize there are going to be 2 other characters on the banner, and your chances are still 50-50 to get one of these, and you can lose pity on the 4-star and just get something off banner as well. So let's move on to the next character on the list, and that one is going to be Chisha. Chisha is, ironically, pretty much exactly the same as Lumi, right? All of her sequence nodes are going to be heavily focused on very personal things like her resonance skill critting, gaining resonance energy, dealing more damage below a certain health threshold, getting more of her forte circuit, getting a bigger attack buff from her inherent skill that builds up when she uses her skill. And then her last node is going to be something a little bit more supportive, buffing the basic attack damage of her entire team by 25% when she's able to get off that final shot of her resonance skill. However, ladies and gentlemen, it's important to keep this in mind. This is one of the worst S6s in the game because Chisha is basically a main DPS. And so whoever you're pairing with her that can actually leverage this buff, it doesn't make sense for her to have this basic attack damage buff. If this was instead like resonance skill, oh my gosh, the character would be like 30 times better. Because then you would have this like buffing Changli's damage, or I guess in this case, you could use her with Encore and dual DPS, but it's not that good. The only character that feels like it makes sense is Jeja. And if you're using Jeja with Chisha, you have to ask yourself, what are you doing with your roster? If you're at the point where you're pairing Jeja with Chisha across your main teams, that is like taking the best audio system on Earth for a car and then putting it in a 2005 Honda Civic. Sure, it'll work, right? You're gonna get really nice audio quality in that car, but why in God's green earth would you do that? Just use Jeja with literally any of her way better optimal partners. And the thing is, Jeja doesn't even buff Chisha that well either, because a majority of Chisha's damage, a good portion of it is resonance skill, but she does way more in other types of damage across her kit. And so this one right now feels like it doesn't really have a proper partner, and it just feels like a strange upgrade for her. Maybe an artifact from 1.0, but what can you do there? So next character that we're going to be looking at is, of course, Alto. The third, I'm just going to call it the third dud of this banner. Alto is, quite honestly, one of the worst value sequence node upgraders in the game. His first one is honestly his best. His first one is his best because it straight up reduces the cooldown of his resonance skill by 4 seconds. It's absolutely insane for actually getting his rotations off, making them a lot faster, and making him feel more playable. The next one, it's kind of clunky. His missed avatar, his taunt, gets hit, and then his attack increases by 15%. It's alright. It's nothing too crazy. His third one gives him a lot more personal damage, which is pretty cool. His fourth also gives him some more personal damage and gives him a damage reduction buff, but it's not that big of a deal because if you're getting hit with him, your damage is falling off a cliff anyways. And his fifth one gives him another personal damage bonus, and his sixth gives him another personal damage bonus, but then also adds a tiny 8% crit rate to his Resonance Liberation's Windgate. But think about it this way, ladies and gentlemen. His Windgate does allow you to use melee attacks as long as the melee attacks pass through it, but oh my gosh, it's stationary. If the boss moves, you basically lose the entire effect of this S6, and this boost to his heavy attack, ladies and gentlemen, let me just show you what the ratio on Alto's heavy attack is. It's 74.88. Fully charged at level 9. What is the point of this ability doing 50% more damage when it literally does less damage with that buff than the 5th hit of his basic attack chain? Honestly, it does less than the 3rd and the 4th hits. This is genuinely, straight up, just one of the worst sequence nodes in the game. This thing is terrible. This line over here about his heavy attack, it should just not even be in the kit. And instead, you might as well pretend that this crit rate boost is the only thing. So overall, the 4 stars on this banner, depending on whether or not you really want to use Lumi, they're really not that good. I would not recommend them. If this is a banner, right, you pulled your Phoebe, maybe you just want to like build a little bit of pity, do not do it on this banner. Unless you're looking for Lumi copies and you want to get Lumi to S6 and you plan on using her as like a dual DPS, sub DPS support kind of role, just don't do it. Do not build Pity on this banner, you will regret it. Or maybe you're somebody that already has all these characters S6 and you just want to build up the Afterglow Coral for dupes. Maybe that's the only reason you're pulling. But if it's to get actual value out of these characters, it's not a good one, ladies and gentlemen. It's not a good one. Lumi's the only real catch on this list here. So, next up, let's just continue on with the characters and talk about the Brant Changli banner. So, I'm going to be honest about this one. There's only one real winner here. And that winner, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be Mortefi. Mortefi is the only good 4-star on this side because his bonus is incredible. After casting his Resonance Liberation, or basically ending his team's rotation, he will have a 20% attack buff to the entire team. And guess what, guys? You're far more likely to have a lot more copies of this dude because he's been on way more banners than Lumi. He's actually on the very first banner in the game for Jian. And if you don't have him S6 yet, he's an incredible S6 to have just from the perspective of he's found new use with a character like Jian Xin to battery Jinxie. He's obviously the best in slot support for Jian. And guess what, guys? His outro buff is so specifically focused on heavy attacks that he is going to be a great buffer for heavy attacks until the end of time. He is, in my opinion, one of the most future-proof units just from the perspective of there's going to be another character that deals heavy attack damage, and when that happens, he's going to be a best-in-slot support for them. Unless they scale with like HP or defense and they deal heavy attack damage, Mortefi will be a best-in-slot support for them. And so you could view this as future-proofing. He's probably going to be on banner when the next heavy attacker releases, but he has just some of the best personal damage and some of the best buffs in the game, and has a pretty decently fast rotation time as well. He's a bit like a slower version of Sanhua that does a lot more damage, and honestly, with the coordinated attack set, with Empyrate Anthem on him, he's pretty impressively strong. Next up, we've got Tao Chi and Yohu. I'll be covering Yohu first, because I'm gonna be honest, guys, I absolutely despise this character. This character feels like they shouldn't actually exist at this point in the game. What you're gonna see over here is that they gain a weird 10% damage immunity, a 10% chance. It might as well not exist. They get a damage bonus buff, an attack buff, RNG cooldown resets, a crit rate boost, and then a crit damage boost. This character is like supposed to be like a hybrid damage dealer that buffs coordinated attacks, amplifies them, and then also heals the team. And the weird thing is just, it feels like her kit is all over the place. You're supposed to use her as a main DPS, but she supports coordinated attacks. In my mind, she was an experiment by Kuro Games, and I think it was an experiment that didn't really pan out. She just feels so awkward to use. She's just weaker than every other healer in the game, even in her optimal composition. She's supposed to be a hybrid damage dealer and support, but she just sucks at both. And it feels like she has no spot on any person's roster and doesn't do anything at all. I am scared when pulling Brant or maybe Changli of getting copies of her because there is almost no use case for her at any point on any roster in the game. Completely, absolutely useless. One of the worst characters I've ever seen. Building her is honestly just, it's tantamount to just bricking your account, building this character and trying to use her, because those resources that you spend are literally better spent on any other character in the game. She just does nothing. The sum of her team is worse than all of the parts. So that's going to be Yohu. She's benched at level 1 for a reason. Now let's get into the last character on this side, and that's going to be Tao Chi, ladies and gentlemen. So Tao Chi is a bit of an interesting one. She gains more sustaining ability. She's a shielder on her S1. She gains personal damage on her S2 on her liberation. She gains a big increase to her shield duration at S3. She gains more of a shield and increased defense scaling, or honestly attack scaling, whenever she uses her parry properly. No one's using this parry ever. And on her 5th, she gains a resonance energy boost, which is actually really good. And on her 6th, well, her 6th is one of the most useless things in the game because she gains a buff to her basic and heavy attack damage while she has a shield active. But think about it this way, ladies and gentlemen. She scales entirely off of defense on several of her abilities. And these attacks that are getting buffed, they scale off attack. And so while she does have some minor scaling over here, like on her strategic parries, and on her timed counters, considered as basic attack damage, boy oh boy, there's such a small part of her kit and she doesn't really deal damage in the first place. This has to be one of the worst S6s I've ever seen. But you can also think about it this way. If your Tao Chi is, in fact, being used as more of a support, maybe being used as a support for a character like Carlotta, Tao Chi's S5, which gives her a shit ton more resonance energy and, you know, dramatically reduces her requirements, as well as her S3, which increases the duration of her shield, well, they're not the worst things ever to have. And if you're able to pull a copy of Discord, right, more multiple copies of Discord, her rotation time really isn't that bad. And it's very easy to work around in pretty much all of your gameplay, especially when you're using it with Carlotta, to get some pretty decent rotations off that, you know, aren't that much slower than Judges. They are slower, though. And so she is probably, if your Carlotta does have the ER for it, like 125, she's usable. However, she's definitely not as usable and not as good as Mortifi is in terms of overall value. She's kind of just workable, and she doesn't have the same exact attack buffs as a character, right, that Mortifi has at S6. So Tao Chi has more partners, technically, in the current state of the game, but yeah. All right, so that covered the character banners. Let's get into the weapons. So I'm just gonna be honest. This is gonna be on Phoebe's weapon banner. Every weapon here sucks ass, except for Discord. And Discord has one user in the game, Tao Chi. And so if you're not using Tao Chi and you don't plan on using Tao Chi, all three of these weapons are fucking awful. They're all terrible. This, depending on whether or not you use Tao Chi, is actually the worst weapon banner I've ever seen. And when you factor in that there's a free-to-play version of Phoebe's weapon that they're giving out, again, for free through the event, the fishing event, holy moly. You're pulling on this banner, ladies and gentlemen, just for Phoebe. This isn't like the Rocha banner, right? Where it's actually a pretty decent pull because you have the potential, right, to get variation. Building pity on the current banner right now, or it's probably going to be gone by the time this video releases. Building pity on this banner is not a bad idea. It is not a bad idea at all. You want to know why? Because you can get variation. This banner, on the other hand, there is nothing of value here unless you're okay with getting Discord. So my recommendation is only pull on this if you want Phoebe's weapon and you want her to have the best performance ever. Do not pull on this to build any pity at all. It is completely dog shit. It's terrible. And if you want a reason why, this is an attack stat stick that is outperformed by craftable weapons. This is another attack stat stick that is again outperformed by craftable 4-star weapons, and this thing is only good on Tao Chi. That's the rundown. Never upgrade these. Don't even refine them. You might as well use them as experience fodder at this point. That's how bad these two weapons are. But this at least has a use case, even though it is limited. Moving on to Brant's weapon banner. Brant's and Changli's. It's a somewhat similar story. Marcado is a weapon that is also very, very specific in its use case because not a lot of characters actually want it. The only character I can think of on my mind that makes use of Marcado is maybe Jianshin, if you're trying to get her to have faster rotations at the cost of pretty much all of her sustaining ability. Because if you use Marcado on her, ladies and gentlemen, the base attack on it is so absurdly low that Jianshin is going to have none of her damage and none of her shielding. And so you're basically only using her for her buffs at that point. And if that's the reason why, Marcado is going to be a good pick. WuWa, on the other hand, he's a little bit better on Marcado because, well, he doesn't scale off of attack. However, WuWa literally has some of the worst concerto energy generation in the game, and his concerto skill, his outro skill, is also one of the worst in the game because it gives no buffs at all. It actually doesn't do any damage either, and I guess it greatly reduces the vibration strength of enemies, but every intro skill in the game also deals a great amount of vibration damage to enemies. Every single one. And so it's honestly faster for Verena to battery intro skills than for WuWa to build up his concerto to actually use this ability. It kind of just sucks. So the next weapon that we have to look at is Waning Redshift. This one is a little bit more interesting. Waning Redshift is in the Black Shores series of weapons. It gives a resonance, or casting a resonance skill gives you energy and then also increases attack by 10%. And then, you know, this scales up pretty decently as well. It also has some of the highest base stats in the game for a 4-star weapon, and it looks decent. However, guys, it is going to be outperformed by pretty much every single 5-star in the game. And believe me when I say it's not expensive to level these up. And so if you don't want to pull the standard Broadblade and you don't have any of the limited 5-stars, it is something that you can use. But if you do want something that's craftable, the new Renacita 4-stars also have the same exact stat line and are a little bit, easier in some teams to activate. You might want to level up one of these for Whimpering Wastes, but my recommendation is either pull the standard broad blade and just work with better base stats, or just pull 2 copies, right, of separate limited weapons. It's workable, but it is something that you're going to just straight up replace on your account. And if it's something that you're going to replace, like my Autumn Trace over here, well, let's be honest, guys, I'm never going to get all these mats back. And if you level this up and you replace it, you're never going to get those mats back either. And the last weapon we have, Comet Flare. Boy, oh boy. This thing is some absolute doo-doo water. I don't even know why this thing is in the game. It has it scales with HP and attack. Dealing basic attack damage or heavy attack damage increases your healing bonus. Who is this for? Who is this for? Nobody uses this. It's actually one of the worst weapons we've ever seen. So with that, hopefully, it's become a little bit clear here that this weapon banner isn't very high value either. The only W's I could see on it are Mercado, if you're trying to use John Shin or Yan Wu, and maybe Waning Redshift if for some reason you really want a 4-star weapon that's usable. And you're going to see for Changli's weapon banner, it's the same exact thing. These might be some of the worst 4-star banners we've ever seen, because there is like almost no win for Phoebe. Her weapon banner is also trash. When it comes to Brant and Changli, there's sort of one win over here for Mortifi, but the other 2 are pretty bad. And you can arguably say there's no win over here. Overall, I would say that pulling the characters on this version, Kuro didn't give us a lot of incentives to do that through the 4 stars. And so hopefully all the value that we're seeing from the new 5-star characters, the weapons being strong, the characters being strong and unique and providing a lot of like, a lot of life to the gameplay, that's going to be what gets you guys pulling, because you're not getting dupes of Sanhua here. You're not getting dupes of like other high value 4 stars. You're not getting very, very good weapons. They're all just kind of like shit. And with that in mind, don't build pity on any of these banners. That's my recommendation. Variation is a different story, but it's not here and it's not in this version. So with that, hopefully that's better informed some of your pulling decisions for this patch. Peace out.